Welcome to Love DoOver, where every story is a journey through heartbreak, healing, and rediscovery. In this story, he laughed when she said she was pregnant. Years later, the truth returned. We dive deep into the raw, human emotions that make love both beautiful and devastating. Before we begin, remember this: if you've ever loved and lost, or thought you'll never find love again, this story is for you. Subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss a new tale of heartbreak and rebirth. The night Sophia's mother did not come home, the air in Florida felt heavier than usual, as though the heat itself had decided to stay and watch. Sophia was 9 years old, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor with her homework spread out in uneven piles, the ceiling fan clicking as it turned. She kept glancing at the clock on the wall, the second hand sweeping forward with an arrogance that irritated her. Her mother was never late without calling. Never. Sophia had already practiced the complaint she planned to deliver, half playful, half serious, about reheated dinners and forgotten promises. By the time the sun disappeared and the streetlights hummed awake outside, irritation had softened into something quieter. She turned the television on for background noise, letting voices fill the room so the silence would not start asking questions. When headlights finally spilled across the front window, relief rose in her chest so quickly it startled her. She jumped up, smoothing her shirt as if her mother might notice. But the lights did not pass the house the way they usually did. They stopped. Moments later, the red and blue glow of police lights washed across the pale walls, turning the familiar living room into something foreign. Sophia froze near the doorway, her hand hovering just above the doorknob, unsure whether opening it would invite answers or steal them away. When the knock came, it was careful, practiced, and far too gentle. Later that evening, as voices moved around her without ever quite landing where she stood, Sophia learned that there would be no explanation that made sense. Words like accident and unavoidable floated through the room, brushing past her ears without settling. Her mother's name sounded strange in other people's mouths. She stared at the patterned rug beneath her feet and wondered if it had always been so faded in the corner near the couch, or if she had simply never noticed before. At some point, someone asked if there was anyone they could call. A father, perhaps. Sophia answered before thinking, her voice thin but steady. There was no one. There never had been. The sentence ended the conversation more efficiently than tears would have. She did not cry then. She watched adults exchange looks instead, as if her words had rearranged the room. That night, the housekeeper, Mrs. Alvarez, did not leave. She brewed tea no one drank and folded blankets already neatly folded. She spoke softly, not filling the silence but standing guard against it. Sophia noticed this even then, how staying could be louder than reassurance. When Sophia finally fell asleep on the couch, her head pillowed against Mrs. Alvarez's arm, it was the first time she understood that loyalty did not always announce itself. The following morning, the house felt wrong in daylight. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee her mother would never finish, and Sophia stood in the doorway of her bedroom, unsure whether entering it would change something she was not ready to name. Mrs. Alvarez packed a small bag without being asked. There was a car waiting outside soon after, familiar and unfamiliar at once. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison lived next door, in the large house with the wide porch and the tree everyone climbed. Sophia had spent half her childhood there already, slipping in and out as though it were an extension of her own home. Now, as she sat in the back seat between Mrs. Alvarez and a borrowed pillow, she realized the difference between visiting and arriving. Mrs. Morrison did not say much on the drive, and neither did Mr. Morrison. They did not explain what would happen next, and Sophia was grateful for that. Explanations required questions, and questions required answers that did not exist yet. When they reached the house, Mrs. Morrison simply took Sophia's hand and led her inside, her grip warm and sure. That was the moment Sophia understood that some decisions were made quietly, without ceremony, because they did not need permission. The first night there, Sophia slept in the guest room, though Mrs. Morrison insisted it was hers now. The ceiling was higher than the one at home, and the unfamiliar creaks of the house startled her awake more than once. Each time, she lay still, listening. Grief, she discovered, had a sound. In her mother's house, it echoed, bouncing off walls that remembered laughter. Here, it was muffled, absorbed by footsteps in the hallway and the low murmur of voices downstairs. Neither was easier. They were simply different. 2 days later, Ryan and Roy burst into the room without knocking, arguing loudly about who had found her first. They were 9 too, identical in every way that mattered to them, and Sophia felt something in her chest loosen when they grinned at her like nothing had changed. They dragged her outside before she could protest, insisting she had missed everything important. The tree had a new branch perfect for climbing. Someone had scraped a knee. Life, according to the twins, had continued with impressive commitment. Sophia laughed despite herself, then immediately felt guilty for it. The guilt surprised her more than the laughter had. She tucked it away, filing it under thoughts she would examine later. Even then, her sense of humor worked quietly, offering observations she kept to herself. Like how grief apparently allowed twins to yell indoors without consequence. Or how adults spoke in whispers as though sorrow might be startled. The next morning, she returned to her own house with Mrs. Alvarez to collect clothes. The rooms were too still, as if holding their breath. Sophia moved through them carefully, touching familiar objects the way one might test water with a toe. She took more socks than necessary and a book she had already read twice. When she left, she locked the door behind her and wondered if houses noticed such things. By the end of that week, routines began forming without asking permission. School resumed. Homework reappeared. Dinner happened at the same time each night. Sophia learned which stair creaked and which cupboard stuck. She learned that Mrs. Morrison checked on her every night without making a show of it. She learned that Mr. Morrison whistled softly when he thought no one was listening. By the end of that summer, the heat had softened slightly, and Sophia realized she had stopped expecting her mother to walk through the door. The realization did not arrive with pain or relief, just a quiet acceptance that surprised her with its weight. She still visited her house, still slept there some nights, but the Morrison home had learned her footsteps. Ryan and Roy remained her noise, her interruption to sorrow, pulling her back into the world when it threatened to shrink. Sophia did not stop missing her mother. She simply learned where to place the missing so it did not consume every room. Even at 9, she understood that survival was not about forgetting. It was about learning how to live inside the silence without letting it be the only thing that spoke. Daily life did not announce its return to Sophia. It slipped back in quietly, the way water finds cracks, filling spaces she had assumed would remain empty. Mornings began to alternate between two houses, though the distinction blurred quickly. Some nights she slept in her mother's home, the one that still smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and memories, and other nights she fell asleep under the Morrison roof, listening to the creak of stairs and the distant hum of conversation. It did not feel like choosing one place over the other. It felt like learning how to live in between. The room Mrs. Morrison insisted was Sophia's became official a few weeks later, though no one used the word. One afternoon, after school, Sophia returned to find her clothes folded neatly in the dresser and her books lined up along the shelf. There was a small lamp on the bedside table, its shade patterned with tiny flowers, and a quilt folded at the foot of the bed that had not been there before. Mrs. Morrison hovered in the doorway, pretending to adjust the frame of a picture she had already straightened twice. Sophia understood what was being offered and accepted it without ceremony, nodding once and feeling something inside her loosen and tighten all at once. Even with her own room, she still returned to her mother's house often, especially at night. Mrs. Alvarez stayed on, her presence steady and grounding, and Sophia clung to the familiar routines they had shared. Some evenings, she ate dinner at the Morrisons, laughed until her cheeks hurt, then walked next door with the quiet heaviness that only arrived when laughter faded. Other nights, she stayed where she was, curled up with the sounds of too many boys arguing over nothing at all. There was no schedule, just instinct, and somehow that was enough. Outside, Florida offered its own version of healing, though Sophia would not have named it that way then. The afternoons were heavy with sun, the kind that pressed down on shoulders and slowed everything to a deliberate pace. Tree climbing became an almost daily ritual, the bark rough against her palms, the branches familiar beneath her feet. Scraped knees were worn like badges, proof that she was still capable of movement, still part of something active and loud. Laughter became a kind of currency, traded freely and valued highly, especially when it came easily. Ryan and Roy remained her constants, their energy unrelenting. They argued loudly, forgave quickly, and expected Sophia to keep up. Fred, younger and perpetually bruised, followed them everywhere, his questions tumbling over one another. Charles, already taller and more serious, liked to explain rules no one followed. And then there was Scott. Scott was different, not just because he was older, though that mattered. He hovered at the edges of her awareness, present but untouchable, like something seen through glass. At 13, he already moved with a confidence that made Sophia acutely aware of her own smallness. He did not climb trees or chase the twins. He leaned against doorframes, arms crossed, watching the chaos with amused patience. When he spoke to Sophia, it was kindly, casually, as though she were simply part of the scenery he had grown up with. She liked that and resented it in equal measure, though she could not have explained why. 2 weeks after school resumed, Sophia noticed she had stopped counting the days since her mother's death. The realization caught her off guard while she was sitting on the Morrison porch, watching the boys kick a ball back and forth across the yard. She waited for guilt to follow, for some sharp reminder that she was not supposed to forget. Instead, there was only a dull ache, familiar and constant, like a scar pressed too often. Grief, she was learning, did not vanish. It softened around the edges, reshaping itself into something that could be carried without constant collapse. 2 years later, that truth remained unchanged. Sophia was 11 by then, her limbs longer, her voice steadier, her humor sharper. She noticed things more clearly now, catalogued them quietly. How adults spoke about her future as though it were a collective project. How people paused before mentioning her mother, as if checking for permission. How the Morrison house had begun to treat her presence as inevitable, her absence as temporary. Her inner thoughts became her refuge, a place where observations were safe from correction. She wondered why boys were allowed to be loud when they were happy but hushed when they were sad. She wondered why adults believed silence was kindness. She wondered, occasionally, whether belonging was something one claimed or something one was granted. These thoughts amused her, sometimes more than they troubled her, and she learned to smile at the irony of growing up surrounded by people while often feeling privately singular. Later that evening, after dinner had dissolved into noise and scattered plates, Sophia sat on the floor of her room, sorting through school papers. Scott passed by the open door, paused, and leaned in to ask about her day. His voice was easy, unassuming, and she found herself answering honestly, surprised by how much that mattered. When he left, she stared at the doorway longer than necessary, then shook her head at herself, muttering something about overthinking. Even then, she had a habit of catching her own emotions before they could grow legs. Florida summers stretched on, predictable in their intensity. Afternoons sagged beneath the sun, cicadas droning their relentless soundtrack. Routine settled in, comforting and dull. School, home, dinner, laughter, sleep. Sophia learned the rhythm so well she could anticipate it without effort. There was safety in that, though she sometimes feared what would happen if she ever stepped out of it. The Morrisons never said she was theirs. They did not need to. It lived in the way Mrs. Morrison bought extra of everything without comment. In the way Mr. Morrison included her in conversations about plans and repairs. In the way Scott, Fred, Charles, Ryan, and Roy treated her as both sister and anomaly, someone expected to be there but never questioned. The unspoken belief hovered over the house like a settled truth. Sophia was part of this family's future, whatever shape that future might take. On certain nights, lying in her bed at the Morrisons, Sophia listened to the sounds of the house settling, the familiar creaks and murmurs. She thought about her mother, not with the sharp pain of before, but with a quieter longing. She thought about how life had rearranged itself without asking her permission, and how, somehow, she had learned to move within it. Belonging, she decided, was not always about ownership. Sometimes it was about being woven in so tightly that removal would leave a noticeable gap. By the time summer faded again, Sophia no longer questioned where she fit. She still felt the edges of her difference, still carried the memory of loss like a small, persistent weight, but she had grown among boys who refused to let her disappear into it. And though she did not know it then, The house that had learned her silence was also teaching her how to speak again, one ordinary day at a time. By 15, Sophia had learned the difference between knowing something and admitting it. She noticed Scott differently without intending to, the way one notices a change in the weather only after already feeling it on their skin. It began subtly, almost politely. The sound of his name landing in conversation felt heavier than before. The way her attention shifted when his car pulled into the driveway irritated her, and irritation, she discovered, was often a disguise. Scott was at university by then, his visits reduced to holidays and short breaks, his presence something that arrived in concentrated doses. When he came home, the house adjusted around him without discussion. Meals stretched longer. Laughter carried farther. Even the walls seemed to listen more closely. Sophia observed all of this with a careful detachment she had perfected over the years, pretending not to notice how the house's gravity changed when he was there. The following week after his arrival for winter break, she found herself lingering in shared spaces longer than necessary. She volunteered to help in the kitchen, sat on the steps instead of retreating to her room, invented reasons to cross the living room when he was there. None of it felt intentional. It felt inevitable, which unsettled her more than desire ever could. She masked the shift the only way she knew how. Sarcasm became her armor, sharpened and polished. She teased Scott mercilessly, commenting on his college wisdom, and mockingly asking if he had learned anything useful besides how to eat instant noodles. He laughed easily, unfazed, and occasionally fired back, their exchanges comfortable and familiar. On the surface, it looked like nothing had changed. Inside, Sophia felt the constant hum of something unsteady, like standing too close to a speaker. Later that evening, after the house had quieted and most of the boys had disappeared into their rooms, Sophia found herself on the porch with Scott. The Florida night was mild for winter, the air carrying the faint scent of salt and damp earth. They sat side by side on the steps, neither in a hurry to speak. It was during moments like these that she felt most undone, the stillness giving her too much room to think. Their conversations stretched without effort, drifting from harmless observations to surprisingly personal territory. Scott talked about classes he disliked, professors who bored him, and the strange loneliness of being surrounded by people while feeling fundamentally unseen. Sophia listened carefully, offering occasional commentary, her voice steady even as something in her chest tightened. She spoke about school, about Ryan and Roy's endless energy, about how she sometimes felt older than she was. She did not mention the nights she lay awake listening to silence, or the way belonging still felt provisional. Those truths remained hers alone. 2 nights later, they were back on the porch, this time with mugs of something warm Mrs. Morrison had pressed into their hands before retreating inside. Scott leaned back against the railing, looking up at the sky, and Sophia found herself studying the line of his jaw in the soft porch light. The realization startled her. She quickly looked away, her mind scrambling for something dismissive to think. She settled on annoyance instead, annoyed at herself for noticing at all. This was the undoing happiness brought with it. Wanting his attention while fearing it in equal measure. Wanting him to stay seated beside her while dreading the moment he might stand and leave. Every interaction felt weighted, though he remained blissfully unaware of the significance she assigned to each glance and laugh. Sophia understood, even then, that her feelings were not dangerous because of their depth, but because of their silence. The next morning, she woke with a sense of emotional hangover, the kind that arrived after realizing you had revealed too much, even when you had not spoken a word. At breakfast, she doubled down on humor, joking loudly, interrupting conversations, ensuring no one looked too closely at her. Scott ruffled her hair as he passed, a familiar gesture that now landed differently, and she flinched before she could stop herself. He noticed, pausing briefly, but said nothing. Sophia told herself she was imagining things, that 15 was simply an age prone to exaggeration. As the days of his break passed, she grew adept at managing the internal balancing act. She positioned herself close enough to be noticed, but distant enough to remain safe. She laughed at his jokes and mocked his habits with practiced ease. Inside, she catalogued everything, from the cadence of his voice to the way he listened when others spoke. She hated herself for the attention she paid and hated even more that she could not seem to stop. Later that winter, his departure arrived with little warning. One evening, the house buzzed with last-minute activity, bags appearing by the door, schedules discussed over dinner. Sophia felt the news settle into her body like cold water. She nodded when spoken to, smiled when expected, and helped carry a suitcase to the car as though this were any other goodbye. On the driveway, Scott hugged everyone in turn. When it was Sophia's turn, the embrace lingered a second longer than necessary, or perhaps she imagined that too. Either way, when he pulled away, the absence felt immediate and sharp. She watched the car disappear down the street, her hands clenched in her pockets, the familiar ache in her chest resurfacing with a new, more complicated voice. That night, the house felt quieter than usual, the silence stretching into corners it had not reached in years. Sophia lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, acutely aware of how absence could occupy space. She had known silence as grief, as loss, as something survivable. This silence was different. It pressed in, insistent and personal, and she had no name for it that did not frighten her. The following week, she resumed her routines with exaggerated enthusiasm. School, chores, jokes delivered on cue. When Ryan and Roy complained about missing their brother, she rolled her eyes and told them to enjoy the peace while it lasted. When Mrs. Morrison mentioned Scott in passing, Sophia responded lightly, changing the subject before her thoughts betrayed her. She told no one, not even herself, what had begun to take shape. Naming it would make it real, and reality came with expectations she was not prepared to meet. Instead, she leaned harder into humor, declaring herself immune to love whenever the topic arose among friends. Love, she insisted, was overrated, inefficient, and best avoided. She delivered these opinions with enough confidence to convince most people, including herself, at least on good days. In quieter moments, alone in her room or walking the familiar path between houses, she acknowledged the truth in fragments. That noticing someone could change the way the world felt. That wanting did not require permission. That silence, when layered with longing, could ache in ways grief never had. By 15, Sophia understood that growing up did not arrive all at once. It came in subtle shifts, in feelings that refused to stay hidden, in realizations that unsettled carefully built defenses. She did not yet know what she would do with what she felt, only that it had arrived and intended to stay, reshaping her inner landscape with a patience that both impressed and unnerved her. At 17, Sophia had grown accustomed to solitude, though she would not have described it that way. Being alone in her mother's house felt different from being lonely. The house carried her history without comment, the walls holding memories gently rather than demanding attention. That night, the Florida air was thick and unmoving, the kind that pressed against the windows as though asking to be let in. Sophia sat on the couch with her legs tucked beneath her, a book open but unread in her lap, the television murmuring to itself in the background. She was staying there for the week, easing herself into independence the way one might test unfamiliar shoes before committing to a long walk. Mrs. Alvarez had gone home earlier than usual, reminding Sophia to lock the doors and call if she needed anything. Sophia had smiled, promised she would, and meant it in the abstract way people often did. She liked the quiet. It gave her space to think without interruption, even if she sometimes had to negotiate with her thoughts to keep them from wandering too far. Later that evening, just as she was considering turning in for the night, there was a knock at the door. It was firm but hesitant, as though whoever stood on the other side was reconsidering the decision even as it was being completed. Sophia froze, her heart thudding once, sharply, before settling into a steady rhythm that surprised her with its calm. Visitors were rare at that hour. She stood slowly, moving toward the door with cautious curiosity. When she opened it, Scott was standing there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The porch light cast familiar angles across his face, and yet something about him felt different, unsettled. He looked older than she remembered, his presence carrying a weight she could not immediately name. Familiar and unfamiliar coexisted in the same breath, and Sophia found herself caught between recognition and surprise. "I was in the neighborhood," he said finally, a half-smile tugging at his mouth, as though aware of how insufficient the explanation sounded. She nodded, stepping aside without thinking, allowing him into the house. The door closed behind them with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have. Inside, the air felt suddenly charged, the quiet no longer passive but alert. They sat across from each other in the living room, conversation circling cautiously at first. He spoke about being home for a short break, about the strange pull of familiar streets, about how he found himself driving without intention. Sophia listened, offering small comments, her thoughts splintering between disbelief that he was there at all and the sharp awareness of how close he sat. At some point, the distance between them narrowed without either of them acknowledging how. It happened the way tides shift, gradually and then all at once. When he leaned in, she did not have time to decide whether to step back. The kiss arrived unexpected, overwhelming in its immediacy, disarming in the way it bypassed thought entirely. Her mind scattered, clinging to fragments of sensation and surprise, the world narrowing to the space they shared. She knew, even as it happened, that this was a line crossed without ceremony. Want surged alongside disbelief, braided so tightly she could not tell where one ended and the other began. She responded instinctively, her hands resting where they landed, her breath unsteady but willing. There were no grand declarations, no promises shaped for permanence. The night unfolded quietly, shaped by closeness and unspoken understanding, guided more by feeling than intention. Time slipped by unnoticed, hours passing without acknowledgement. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its familiar nocturnal hush, the cicadas resuming their rhythm as though nothing extraordinary were occurring. Inside, Sophia felt suspended between versions of herself, aware that something fundamental was shifting even if she could not yet articulate what it meant. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft and unassuming. Sophia woke slowly, her body heavy with sleep and memory. She turned toward the other side of the bed and found it empty. The absence landed gently at first, then with increasing clarity. She sat up, listening. The house was quiet, unchanged, as though the night had been something imagined rather than lived. For a moment, uncertainty crept in, its questions insistent. Had she misunderstood? Had she imagined more meaning than existed? She stood and moved through the house, noting the absence of his shoes by the door, the lack of evidence that he had ever been there at all. And yet, beneath the questions, happiness bloomed with surprising resilience. It was not loud or demanding. It settled into her chest with warmth, persistent despite unanswered questions. She showered, letting the water ground her, replaying moments without dissecting them. She told herself that patience was a sign of maturity, that not everything required immediate clarity. People moved at different speeds, she reasoned, and understanding often arrived after experience, not before. She chose to believe that what had happened mattered, even if it had not yet been defined. Later that day, she went about her routine with a quiet glow she made no effort to conceal. She smiled at nothing, hummed absent-mindedly, found humor in small inconveniences. When she passed the Morrison house in the afternoon, she glanced toward the porch instinctively, then laughed softly at herself. She was not foolish, she insisted. She was simply allowing things to unfold. The following week passed without incident. Scott did not return, did not call, did not explain. Sophia waited without announcing that she was waiting. She told herself that space was reasonable, that lives were busy, that meaning did not evaporate simply because silence intervened. She slept in her mother's house each night, comforted by familiarity, replaying the night with careful restraint, resisting the urge to assign conclusions. 2 weeks later, she found herself sitting on the same couch where she had been when he arrived, the symmetry not lost on her. She considered the possibility that she had misunderstood the significance of the night, that it had meant something different to him than it had to her. The thought stung, but it did not undo the warmth she still carried. She had felt seen, wanted, present in a way that lingered. 3 weeks later, patience began to fray at the edges. Questions pressed harder, no longer content to wait quietly. Still, she did not speak of it. Not to Mrs. Alvarez, not to the Morrisons, not even to the inner voice that knew naming things could give them power. She wrapped her uncertainty in humor when alone, joking aloud about her talent for overthinking, about how 17-year-olds were famously bad at interpreting reality. And yet, beneath the jokes, something had shifted irrevocably. The shape of her world felt altered, subtly but decisively. She had crossed into a space where feelings demanded acknowledgement, where silence carried weight, where patience required effort rather than assumption. She did not know what would come next. She only knew that the night had left its mark, not as regret or triumph, but as a quiet insistence that she was no longer who she had been before the knock at the door. Sophia noticed something was wrong on a Tuesday morning, the kind that pretended to be ordinary until it wasn't. She was standing in her mother's kitchen, the window cracked open to let in the familiar Florida air, when the smell of coffee turned her stomach with sudden insistence. She pressed a hand to the counter, steadying herself, annoyed more than alarmed. She told herself it was stress, or heat, or the way her sleep had been uneven for weeks. At 17, inconvenience still felt like something to outgrow rather than investigate. The following day, the unease did not pass. It lingered through classes, through laughter she forced a little too brightly, through the walk home where the sun seemed intent on pressing every thought flat. When nausea arrived again, sharper and less willing to be ignored, Sophia finally allowed the question to surface. She did not say it aloud. She did not need to. The possibility sat quietly beside her, patient and terrifying. 2 days later, she found herself in a clinic that smelled faintly of antiseptic and old magazines. The air felt too clean, stripped of warmth. She filled out forms with careful handwriting, her name steady even as her thoughts raced ahead of her. When the nurse returned, her expression neutral and practiced, Sophia watched her mouth move and understood before the words fully landed. Confirmation arrived without ceremony, delivered in a tone meant to soften impact but succeeding only in making the room feel smaller. Panic did not announce itself loudly. It seeped in, threading through practical concerns with unsettling efficiency. University was a month away. Acceptance letters sat folded neatly in her drawer, symbols of a future she had clung to with quiet determination. She thought of schedules and deadlines, of dorm rooms and independence, of how carefully she had planned her escape into adulthood. Fear wrapped itself around these thoughts, but beneath it all was a stubborn resolve. She would manage. She had always managed. The next morning, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, rehearsing words she had never imagined saying. She practiced calm explanations, rational tones, sentences that sounded responsible and grounded. Each version dissolved the moment she tried to hold it, leaving her breathless and frustrated. By afternoon, she settled on honesty, stripped of ornament. It would have to be enough. She went to the Morrison house as the sun dipped lower, the familiar porch light glowing softly. Her heart pounded as she asked for Scott, her voice steady despite the way her hands trembled. He agreed to talk outside, motioning toward the side of the house where conversations could remain private. The cicadas had begun their evening chorus, indifferent to human crises. She told him simply. She was pregnant. She waited for his face to change, for recognition or confusion or anything that suggested shared understanding. Instead, he laughed. The sound cut through the evening air, loud and sharp, startling in its intensity. For a moment, Sophia wondered if she had misheard him, if perhaps nerves had distorted reality. But the laughter continued, unrestrained and incredulous, and something inside her cracked without making a sound. "Why are you telling me?" he asked between breaths, amusement lingering where seriousness should have been. She answered honestly, her voice small but unwavering. "Because you're the father." His laughter grew louder, spilling beyond the boundaries of privacy she had hoped to preserve. It carried into the house, drawing attention like a signal flare. Doors opened. Footsteps approached. The Morrison family gathered, faces lined with confusion as Scott repeated her words between bursts of disbelief. Sophia stood rooted to the spot, her world tilting as eyes turned toward her. She reached into her bag with shaking hands and pulled out the medical report, the paper creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. She handed it to Mrs. Morrison, her fingers brushing the older woman's briefly, seeking something steady to hold on to. The room filled with murmurs, questions layered with disbelief. Scott dismissed it all with a wave of his hand, insisting she was mistaken, imagining things, letting a childhood crush distort reality. His words landed like accusations dressed up as jokes. Mrs. Morrison asked careful questions, her tone gentle but probing, as though trying to uncover an explanation that did not require accepting the truth. Had someone pressured her? Was she confused? Why would she lie after everything they had done for her? The concern stung more than outright anger would have. It wrapped doubt in kindness, making it harder to defend against. Sophia repeated herself, calmly, clearly, each word costing more effort than the last. She described the night without embellishment, without accusation, offering facts as proof of her sanity. The silence that followed was heavy, disbelieving, final. Her heart fractured quietly, the sound internal and absolute. She realized in that moment that truth did not guarantee belief. That love, even when it had felt unconditional, could hesitate when faced with inconvenience. She stood abruptly, chair legs scraping against the floor, the sound too loud in the stunned room. No one stopped her as she moved toward the door. She did not look back. She could not trust herself to survive the expressions she might see there. Outside, the evening air hit her like cold water. She walked quickly, not caring where she was going as long as it was away. Tears threatened but did not fall. She refused them their release. She made it halfway down the street before footsteps caught up to her. Ryan and Roy appeared at her sides, breathless and frantic, their voices overlapping as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. They told her there had to be a mistake, that things could be fixed if she just explained again. They promised help, solutions, loyalty. Sophia stopped walking and looked at them, really looked at them, and felt a fresh wave of grief. They believed her. Or wanted to. But belief without power was its own kind of cruelty. She told them she needed to be alone. The words came out firmer than she felt. After a moment's hesitation, they nodded, confusion etched across their faces, and let her go. That night, back in her mother's house, Sophia moved with mechanical efficiency. She packed clothes, documents, books, anything that felt necessary. She did not linger over keepsakes. She could not afford sentiment. The house watched her quietly, familiar and unchanged, as if offering silent witness rather than comfort. Later that evening, she sat on the edge of her bed, suitcase zipped, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into sleep. She thought of the girl she had been that morning, unaware and hopeful, and felt the distance between them stretch impossibly wide. There was no time for mourning the life she had imagined. Survival required motion. Before dawn, she loaded the car and drove away from Florida, the horizon pale and waiting. She cried as the familiar streets disappeared behind her. She held the steering wheel tightly and focused on the road ahead, carrying with her the weight of laughter that had broken something precious and the resolve to build something new from what remained. The first thing Sophia noticed about her new state was the cold. It arrived without apology, seeping through her jacket and settling into her bones, a sharp contrast to the Florida heat she had left behind. 2 weeks after she drove away before dawn, she was standing on a campus walkway, breath visible in the air, wondering how a place could feel so vast and so isolating at the same time. The sky seemed wider here, the buildings taller, and the silence between people heavier. University began anyway, indifferent to her circumstances. Lecture halls filled with voices and movement, students complaining about early classes and bad coffee. Sophia sat near the back, taking notes meticulously while her stomach churned in protest. Nausea became a familiar companion, arriving without warning and leaving her pale and unsteady. She learned the fastest routes to restrooms and the art of appearing composed while her body revolted. It was exhausting, but she told herself that exhaustion was temporary. Quitting was not. The following week, she found work at a small cafe near campus. The hours were long, the pay modest, and the customers impatient, but the routine anchored her. She worked between classes, her feet aching as she balanced trays and practiced polite smiles. At night, she returned to her small room, books spread across the desk, studying until her eyes burned. Sleep came in short, uneven stretches, interrupted by worry and the persistent hum of responsibility. Humor, once outward and quick, turned inward and practical. She joked silently about her talent for poor timing, about the universe's sense of irony. It was easier to laugh at herself than to dwell on what she had lost. Survival required efficiency, not indulgence, and she became adept at trimming her thoughts to what was useful. As weeks turned into months, the pregnancy progressed in quiet isolation. There were no shared milestones, no one to marvel at ultrasound images or debate baby names. Appointments were solitary affairs, the sterile rooms echoing with questions she answered alone. She learned to celebrate small victories privately, like finishing an exam despite dizziness or working a full shift without needing to sit down. Joy existed, but it was subdued, folded carefully into moments of practicality. Later that winter, snow fell for the first time. Sophia stood by her window, watching flakes drift down, astonished by their softness. She pressed a hand to her growing belly, feeling a flutter that made her catch her breath. In that moment, loneliness sharpened into something almost unbearable. She missed warmth, familiarity, the ease of belonging. But she did not allow herself to regret leaving. She had chosen this path with clear eyes, and she intended to walk it fully. At 18, after a long night that blurred pain and determination into something indistinguishable, Sophia gave birth to twin boys. Leo arrived first, small and indignant, followed minutes later by Liam, quieter but no less demanding. Exhaustion settled into her bones immediately, deep and unrelenting. Holding them both for the first time, she felt awe-tempered by fear. She was responsible for 2 lives now, and the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on her chest. The next morning, the hospital room felt too bright and too quiet. She learned how to feed them, how to interpret cries, how to function on fragments of sleep. Nurses came and went, offering guidance and encouragement, but when night fell, it was just her and the boys. She spoke to them constantly, her voice filling the silence, telling them stories about nothing and everything. It was easier than sitting with her thoughts. Weeks later, she brought them home to a small apartment that suddenly felt much smaller. Days blurred into nights, marked by feedings and diaper changes. Exhaustion became a permanent state, something she navigated rather than fought. She learned to nap in 10-minute intervals and to celebrate showers as luxuries. Humor resurfaced in strange places, like laughing at herself for mistaking salt for sugar or for rocking an empty crib out of habit. The following months tested her in ways she had not anticipated. Balancing coursework with motherhood required creativity and relentlessness. She attended lectures with a baby monitor app open on her phone, completed assignments during nap times, and negotiated extensions with professors who alternated between skepticism and admiration. There were nights she cried quietly, overwhelmed by the enormity of it all, and mornings she woke with renewed determination, fueled by the simple act of her son's breathing. 4 years later, she stood in a graduation gown that felt heavier than expected. The boys, now energetic toddlers, fidgeted in their seats, their laughter echoing through the hall. As she walked across the stage, diploma in hand, pride surged through her, fierce and undeniable. She had done this. Not perfectly, not without cost, but with persistence that had reshaped her understanding of strength. In the months that followed, Sophia secured a stable job she could do online, work that allowed flexibility and paid enough to ease the constant financial strain. Her days settled into a manageable rhythm, structured around the boys' schedules and her own deadlines. Stability, once a distant concept, became tangible. One evening, as she tucked Leo and Liam into bed, Sophia found herself thinking about Florida. Not with bitterness or longing, but with a quiet acknowledgement of roots. The boys were growing fast, and she wanted them to know where she came from, to climb the trees she once had, to run through familiar yards. The decision to return formed not as a desire for closure, but as a recognition of belonging. A few weeks later, she began making plans. She would go back. Not to confront the past or seek validation, but to plant herself where her story had begun. She had become a mother while becoming herself, shaped by loss and resilience in equal measure. Now, she was ready to bring her sons home, carrying with her the strength forged in unfamiliar cold and the quiet confidence that she could face whatever waited there. The humidity greeted Sophia before the state line sign did, pressing against her skin like a familiar hand. Florida smelled the same as it always had: salt, cut grass, warm pavement, and 2 days after packing the last box into a rented truck, she turned onto the street she knew by heart. The houses looked unchanged, sun-bleached and settled, though everything seemed smaller now, as if memory had once stretched it wider than it truly was. She parked in front of her mother's old place and sat for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, breathing through the strange mix of comfort and alertness that rose in her chest. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the windows early, louder and brighter than it ever had up north. Leo and Liam were awake before her, bouncing on the beds with the relentless energy of children discovering a new world. By breakfast, they were already asking questions about everything: why the trees were so big, why the air felt sticky, why lizards darted across the porch. Sophia laughed, flipping pancakes, letting their curiosity fill the space where her own apprehension had been. Later that afternoon, she watched from the porch as the boys climbed the oak tree in the front yard, their laughter ringing out as they dared each other to go higher. It startled her, how easily their bodies found the same foothold she once had, how instinctively they seemed to belong there. For a moment, she could see herself at their age, scraped knees and wild hair, calling out to boys who had once felt like brothers. The memory tightened something in her chest, but she did not turn away. 2 houses down, an older neighbor paused mid-walk, squinting toward the yard. A few minutes later, she waved and crossed the street, smiling in that curious, careful way people do when they sense familiarity but cannot place it. "You must be Marion's girl," she said, eyes flicking between Sophia and the twins. "You look just like her did at that age." Sophia smiled politely, thanked her, and returned to watching the boys. She had learned that resemblance was often the first thread people pulled. By the end of the week, more neighbors stopped by. Some brought casseroles, others offered unsolicited advice about schools and babysitters. Comments slipped in casually, almost kindly. "The boys have your eyes. They're handsome. You're back for good, then?" Sophia nodded, deflected, kept her tone light. She pretended not to hear the quieter questions trailing behind the louder ones. Whispers have a way of spreading without raising their voices. At the grocery store, she felt eyes linger. At the park, conversations paused when she approached, then resumed with softened laughter once she passed. She told herself it did not matter. She had not returned to manage narratives or correct assumptions. Still, some evenings, after the boys were asleep, she sat on the porch and let the weight of being known again settle over her. The following week, she began teaching Leo and Liam what she called the art of humor. When one of them tripped and scraped a knee, she exaggerated her sympathy until they were laughing through tears. When someone asked an intrusive question at the playground, she modeled gentle deflection, turning curiosity into a joke that closed the subject without inviting more. Humor, she explained, was not about hiding, but about choosing how much of yourself the world was allowed to hold. By Friday, the Morrisons had heard. News reached them in fragments at first, offered carefully by neighbors who pretended it was coincidence. By Saturday morning, Mrs. Morrison stood in her kitchen, hands resting on the counter, listening as the last piece settled into place. Sophia was back. She had children. Twins. Boys. The realization moved slowly, like a truth that had waited patiently to be acknowledged. Later that afternoon, a familiar car pulled into Sophia's driveway. She saw it from the window and felt her breath hitch, not in panic, but in recognition. Some things never quite leave the body. She told the boys to finish their coloring and stepped onto the porch as the Morrisons approached the door together, their movements hesitant, as if unsure of their welcome. When Mrs. Morrison looked at her, years seemed to pass between blinks. Her eyes traveled over Sophia's face, searching for something, perhaps confirmation of guilt or relief. Mr. Morrison stood slightly behind her, hands clasped, his expression carefully neutral. The silence stretched, heavy with everything unsaid. "Hello, Mrs. Morrison," Sophia said finally, her voice steady. "It's been a long time." She did not step aside immediately, did not invite or refuse them entry. She allowed the moment to exist as it was. Mrs. Morrison's gaze drifted past her, catching sight of Leo and Liam peeking around the corner, their curiosity unmistakable. Something shifted then, subtle but unmistakable. The boys looked up at Sophia with open trust, then back at the strangers with interest unclouded by history. Mrs. Morrison inhaled sharply, as if a door inside her had finally opened. "I didn't know," she said, the words landing softly but with undeniable weight. It was not an accusation, nor an apology, but an acknowledgment that time had passed without permission. Sophia nodded once. "I know." She stepped aside then, allowing them in, not out of obligation, but because she chose to. The house felt smaller with them inside, but also fuller, as if something long avoided had finally arrived. As the afternoon wore on, conversation moved carefully, like people navigating a room with fragile floors. The twins introduced themselves proudly, showing off their drawings, asking questions without restraint. Mrs. Morrison watched them with an expression that hovered between joy and grief, the truth settling into her bones with quiet insistence. When they left an hour later, nothing had been resolved, and nothing had been undone. But as Sophia closed the door behind them, she felt something loosen. The past still lived on that street, but it no longer owned her. She had returned not as a girl seeking permission to belong, but as a woman who had already claimed her place. Scott did not mean to see the boys that morning. He had come to the house to speak to his parents, to confront the strange quiet that had settled over them since Sophia's return. 2 weeks had passed since the Morrisons first stood in her doorway, and in that time, the neighborhood had tightened around itself, news traveling faster than intention. Scott had heard fragments, twins, boys, her back on the street, and dismissed them with the kind of certainty that comes from believing your own version of the past is complete. He was standing near the front window when the boys ran past the gate, chasing each other with the wild, uncoordinated joy of children who trust the ground beneath their feet. They skidded to a stop under the oak tree, arguing loudly about whose turn it was to climb. Scott's attention snagged on them before he could look away. Something about their movement, the tilt of their heads when they laughed, unsettled him in a way he could not immediately name. A few seconds later, one of the boys glanced toward the house. Their eyes met. The moment stretched, quiet and electric, and Scott felt the strange sensation of recognition without memory. It was not romance or nostalgia that struck him, but something far more physical, like a truth landing too hard in the body to be processed gently. His knees buckled without warning. There was no spectacle in it, no flailing or sound. He simply collapsed, the room tilting as if the floor had decided to abandon him. Mrs. Morrison's voice cut through the air, sharp with alarm, as she rushed to his side. The next thing Scott knew, he was staring at the ceiling, his head throbbing, the world narrowed to sensation and confusion. When he woke later that afternoon, the house was quiet in the way it only became when something important had happened. He tried to sit up and was met with a wave of dizziness that forced him still. Mrs. Morrison sat nearby, her face pale, eyes red but steady. She told him he had fainted, that the doctor said it was likely related to the old injury, the one he had carried like a footnote in his life. It was then that the fragments began to return. Not in a rush, not like a movie rewinding, but in small, disjointed images that refused to be ignored. A late-night knock. A familiar house holding unfamiliar silence. Sophia's face, older than he remembered, younger than she should have been. The way the air had shifted between them, heavy with things neither of them said aloud. He remembered leaving before morning, convincing himself it was better that way. The revelation settled slowly, painfully. The injury he had once shrugged off, the concussion he never fully treated, had taken more than time from him. It had taken responsibility. Memory did not return with forgiveness attached. It returned with weight. Later that evening, Scott walked to Sophia's house alone. The sun was setting, casting the street in amber light, and each step felt deliberate, chosen. When she opened the door, she did not look surprised. Perhaps she had been expecting this moment, or perhaps she had learned not to be startled by the past when it finally gathered courage. They stood in the doorway for a long moment, neither moving aside. The boys' laughter drifted from the backyard, a reminder of why this conversation could no longer be postponed. "I remember," Scott said finally, his voice low, stripped of the ease it once carried. He did not offer explanations or apologies yet. He knew better than to rush for absolution. Not all at once. But enough. Sophia studied his face, searching for something she was not sure she wanted to find. Memory doesn't change what happened, she said, her tone even, controlled. It just means you can no longer say you didn't know. He nodded. I won't. He paused, swallowing hard, choosing his words with care. I was wrong. In ways that mattered. I laughed when I should have listened. I let other people speak for me when I should have stood still and owned what I did. Silence filled the space between them, thick but not hostile. It was the kind of silence that comes after a truth has been laid down and must be examined from all sides. Scott did not reach for her hand. He did not step closer. He stayed where he was, letting the distance speak. Inside, Mrs. Morrison sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded, listening to the muffled cadence of voices through the open window. Each word felt like a bell tolling years she could not retrieve. She had believed in a version of events that required her to look away from discomfort. Now, grief moved through her not as guilt alone, but as mourning for the woman Sophia might have been if she had been believed sooner. When Scott left later that night, nothing had been resolved. Sophia had not offered forgiveness, immediate or implied. She had simply said, being honest now doesn't erase being absent then. It was not a punishment, just a boundary, and Scott accepted it without protest. The following week, he began to show up in quieter ways. He attended school meetings without insisting on recognition. He sat at a distance during soccer practice, learning the rhythm of the boys' lives without interrupting it. When Sophia spoke to him, it was with clarity, not warmth, and he did not mistake restraint for invitation. Mrs. Morrison visited often, bringing meals, offering help that did not ask for gratitude. Sometimes she sat with Sophia on the porch, watching the boys play, grief and affection coexisting in the open air. There were no speeches, no attempts to rewrite the past. Presence became the language they all learned to speak. Scott understood then that persuasion had no place here. Love, if it was ever to exist in any form, would not be argued into being. It would be built or it would not. And so he chose to stay, not as a man seeking redemption, but as one willing to live with the consequences of memory finding its way back. 1 year later, Scott was still there. Not in the grand, attention-seeking way people often imagine redemption should look, but in the quiet accumulation of ordinary moments. He was there at school pickup, standing a little to the side at first, hands in his pockets, letting the boys run to him only if they chose to. He was there when a flat tire turned a grocery run into a logistical puzzle, and he solved it without making it a lesson about gratitude. He was there when the internet went down during one of Sophia's deadlines, sitting at the kitchen table with the boys, inventing ridiculous spelling games to keep them busy while she worked from her phone. 2 weeks into that year, Sophia noticed something unsettling. She had begun to expect him, not with longing or relief, but with the subtle assumption that some presences could be relied upon. The realization irritated her more than it comforted her. Expectation felt too much like trust, and trust had once cost her almost everything. So she tested it. She stopped returning messages for a day, then 2. She changed pickup times without explanation. She corrected him sharply in front of the boys when he overstepped in a way that was small but real. Scott absorbed it all without retreat or defensiveness. He adjusted. He apologized when necessary. He stayed. Healing, Sophia learned, did not move forward in a straight line. Some mornings she woke with a lightness she did not question, moving through the house with ease, joking with the boys about mismatched socks and burned toast. Other mornings, anger surfaced without warning, sharp and disorienting, triggered by nothing more than Scott's laughter drifting in from the backyard. On those days, she kept her distance, choosing solitude over confrontation, and Scott respected the silence without interpreting it as rejection. The following week, Leo came home with a handmade card for Father's Day, the edges uneven, the letters bold and earnest. Sophia found it tucked into Scott's bag, waiting. No one had announced the significance of the moment. No one had instructed the boys on what to feel. The card existed because children recognize consistency long before they understand its name. Later that evening, Sophia stood at the sink, rinsing dishes, staring out the window as the sky softened into dusk. Scott joined her, leaning against the counter, close enough to be present but not imposing. "I didn't ask for that," he said quietly, nodding toward the bag. "I know," she replied. After a pause, she added, "You handled it well." He smiled, not triumphant, just tired and grateful. "I'm learning." Shared laughter returned to the house slowly, like a visitor unsure of its welcome. It showed up during spilled cereal and mismatched shoes, during a disastrous attempt at baking that ended with flour in places no one could explain. It showed up when Scott tried to braid Liam's hair and failed so impressively that even Sophia had to laugh, the sound surprising her with its ease. Trust rebuilt itself not through declarations, but through repetition. Through the way Scott remembered doctor appointments without reminders. Through the way he listened when Sophia spoke about work, offering help only when asked. Through the way he never once suggested that time alone should be rushed, that forgiveness should be expedited for the sake of comfort. Sophia noticed the change in herself one afternoon while watching Scott and the boys build a lopsided treehouse. She was not bracing for disappointment. She was not rehearsing exit strategies in her mind. She was simply watching, present in the moment, allowing joy to exist without bargaining with it. The recognition came quietly, without ceremony, and she did not announce it to anyone, least of all Scott. Love returned without fireworks. It was there in the shared grocery lists and the unspoken agreement about bedtime routines. It was there in the way Scott reached for her coffee mug when he noticed it was empty, refilling it without comment. It was there in the way Sophia leaned into him during long evenings on the porch, her head resting against his shoulder, comfortable enough to rest but alert enough to move away if she needed to. Another year passed, marked not by milestones but by continuity. The boys grew taller, louder, more opinionated. Sophia's work expanded, bringing stability she once thought impossible. Scott remained, his presence no longer a question to be answered, but a fact to be lived with. The conversation about marriage happened on an ordinary night. There was no ring hidden in food, no speech prepared in advance. They were sitting on the couch, the house quiet, the boys asleep, the day finally finished with them. Scott spoke first, his tone careful but sure. "I don't want to fix what happened," he said. "I know that's not possible. I want to choose what happens next. With you. Only if that's something you want to." Sophia considered the question longer than she needed to. Not because she was unsure, but because she understood the weight of answering honestly. Marriage, to her, was no longer a promise of safety. It was a commitment to reality, to showing up even when comfort was not guaranteed. "I don't need rescuing," she said finally, meeting his gaze. "I know," Scott replied without hesitation. "That's not why I'm asking." She smiled then, a small, genuine curve of her mouth that felt like a rival. "Then yes," she said. "But we do it our way." They married the following spring, under a sky that threatened rain but never delivered. There were no illusions woven into the day, no insistence that love erased pain. Instead, there was acknowledgement of years lost, of wounds carried, of the strange, fragile grace of finding each other again without pretending the past had been kinder than it was. As Sophia stood that evening, watching the boys race across the yard, laughter echoing through the air, she thought briefly of the girl she had been. The one who waited in silence. The one who ran when laughter broke her open. The memory no longer burned. It settled into her as something bittersweet, a reminder of distance traveled rather than a place she still lived. Love had not saved her. She had done that herself. Love had simply met her where she stood and chosen to stay. Years later, the porch had learned a different kind of quiet. Sophia sat in the familiar wooden chair as dusk settled over the street, the Florida air warm but forgiving now, no longer pressing down the way it had in her childhood. Time had softened the house without erasing it. The paint had been refreshed, the steps reinforced, the porch light replaced twice, but the bones of the place remained the same. It still knew her footsteps. It still remembered when she had stood here waiting for someone who never came home. Across the yard, Leo and Liam laughed in the unguarded way that only comes from having nothing to defend. They were older now, their voices deeper, their jokes sharper, their movements more confident. One of them nearly tripped over the garden hose, and the other laughed so hard he had to lean against the fence to catch his breath. Sophia smiled, shaking her head as she watched them, a familiar thought passing through her mind about how boys could turn any object into both a hazard and a source of joy. Scott sat beside her, his presence steady in a way that no longer required acknowledgement. His hand rested on the arm of the chair, close enough that she could reach for it if she wanted, distant enough that it felt like choice rather than habit. Every now and then, he commented on the boy's antics, his humor dry, affectionate, shaped by years of learning when to speak and when to simply witness. A breeze moved through the trees, carrying with it the scent of cut grass and something faintly floral from a neighbor's yard. Sophia closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of evening settle around her. When she opened them again, she thought of the girl she had been all those years ago, the one who packed a bag in the middle of the night and left without looking back. She did not feel sorry for that girl anymore. She felt protective of her. The pain of those early years had not vanished, but it had changed shape. It no longer arrived uninvited in the middle of the night, demanding to be felt all at once. Instead, it existed like an old scar, something she noticed occasionally when the weather shifted or when memory brushed too close. It was acknowledged, not avoided, and it no longer told her who she was. Later that evening, after the boys came inside, arguing about who was supposed to lock the back door, Sophia moved through the house with practiced ease. Dinner was simple, laughter easy, the kind that did not require effort or explanation. When Leo teased her about burning the garlic bread again, she raised an eyebrow and informed him that survival was not guaranteed for critics in this household. Scott laughed, the sound comfortable, unforced. Humor had survived everything. It had bent, adapted, sharpened itself into something useful. It had been her armor when she needed one, her bridge when she needed connection, and now it was simply part of the air she breathed. The following week, Sophia found an old box in the hallway closet while looking for extra blankets. Inside were remnants of earlier lives, photographs, a few letters, a ribbon she barely remembered keeping. She sat on the floor, sorting through the contents slowly, allowing herself to feel whatever surfaced. There was sadness, yes, but it was tempered by gratitude. Not the kind that erased loss, but the kind that recognized endurance. She did not rush to put the box away. Some things deserved to be held before being returned to storage. A few days later, she stood in the kitchen early in the morning, the house still quiet, coffee steaming in her mug. Scott joined her, wrapping an arm around her waist from behind, resting his chin lightly on her shoulder. It was an ordinary gesture, unremarkable in its familiarity, and that was what made it precious. "This house feels full," he said softly. Sophia nodded. "It didn't always." "I know," he replied, without apology or defensiveness, just acknowledgement. They stood there for a moment, sharing the silence, the kind that did not ache. Outside, the street began to wake, distant footsteps and passing cars marking the beginning of another day. Years had added layers to their love, not perfection. They still disagreed. They still misread each other at times. But what they had was real, built from patience rather than fantasy, from consistency rather than promise. Love, she had learned, was not proven by intensity, but by presence. That afternoon, Sophia returned to the porch, watching the light shift across the yard as it had so many times before. The house held new memories now, laughter echoing where grief once lingered, conversations replacing silence. The walls had heard sorrow, yes, but they had also learned joy. As dusk deepened, Sophia thought again of her heartbreak, not as a defining chapter, but as a shaping one. It had carved space within her for empathy, for humor, for a resilience she once doubted she possessed. It had taught her how to survive disappointment without becoming it. She reached for Scott's hand then, her fingers curling around his, grounding herself in the present. He squeezed back, not as reassurance, but as companionship. The heartbreak no longer told her story. It had simply given her a beginning. And from that beginning, she had built a life that felt honest, held together not by denial of pain, but by the quiet, enduring choice to keep living fully, even after everything.